Hey, John Gilroy here. In 1978, a rock and roll band in England released an album called Who Are You? Today, we're going to apply Who Are You to the federal government. Hit the music, Manny. Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, the podcast that connects you to federal technology leaders. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. Our guest today is John Pritchard, CEO of a company called Radiant Logic. John, I had a silly open, but we had to talk about identity somehow. Make a lot of sense. Rock and roll. Who are you?
I love it, John, and thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Well, let's keep up with this theme of rock and roll. There's some people who will say that within rock and roll, the gold standard is the Beatles, and that's debatable. However, in technology, I think the gold standard might be Microsoft Active Directory. So let's start with that gold standard. Is that a good place to start when talking about identity in the federal government?
I don't think you can talk about identity without talking about Active Directory.
I agree. I remember studying it years and years ago, and a lot of those principles still apply. Let's maybe encapsulate it for our listeners so they know exactly what you're talking about, maybe expand on LDAP and why it's so valuable.
Yeah, so I find it interesting, especially in the federal space. One, you can sort of appreciate that all these different agencies have really diverse missions. And that's led them to adopt a set of specific technologies over time. And so if you look at like the Department of Interior versus, say, Department of Energy or the DoD, it sort of makes sense that they're going to have sort of these specialized identity and maybe HR system investments. And that's really not different than what we see in sort of the commercial space. But really, there's really no one dominant technology. And in fact, in the federal market, especially, you're going to find that there's just lots and lots of different sort of identity silos that exist. For me, what's a really interesting sort of look at this is a bit of a historical context. So if you look back in history and maybe go, all the way back to, say, the early Cold War, you see this period of centralization that we were going through. And it's mostly because the country was focused on these large-scale defense efforts. And the technology at the time there was mainframes. And so that's, how we sort of created this centralized identity approach around this large mainframe-driven development. And you can argue that might be the beginnings of sort of the legacy of the past. Fast forward to the 70s and 80s, we go through this decentralization period. And the technology happening then was PCs, sort of led to this creation of these departmental systems. LDAP or LDAP became the sort of standard protocol, and you started to have these sort of localized directories of the employees working in your departments. 2000, another period of centralization. What was happening then, that was where Windows became sort of the dominant operating system, right? Office suite. Active Directory is birthed at this point, to your question, John, and that allows really for these Windows systems to have one central way to do authentication and authorization. Early 2000s, we go through another period of decentralization. This is sort of the rise of web services and APIs, and this concept of an API gateway. And what it's trying to do is help not so much human actors, but like non-human actors or machines sort of interoperate. And then 2011, another period of centralization. This is where the federal government really sort of leans into cloud. We start to see sort of multiple cloud providers. You see Okta sort of come on the market. Microsoft brings on the Azure version of Active Directory. AWS is a major player. Late 2010, decentralization again with single sign-on. And even in today, we have this sort of other period around sort of decentralized identity and blockchain. You just take all that in context, that sort of creates this large sort of identity sprawl effect, because through all those periods, these agencies really never had a chance to completely transition from one to the other.
Well, I'm going to take the transcript of that and I'm going to put it in a book, and this will be the first chapter. The next time I do any kind of identity conversation, this review, it's a real nice summary. And I lived through most of it. And what's amazing is how come we're not based on IBM? You would think that it started with that and that would have the legacy, but it didn't carry, did. And for some reason, the decentralization with Microsoft, that impacted more than you realize. It's a real good 30-year perspective. Okay, so what was talked about 20 or 30 years ago is talked about today. The concept is continuous improvement. And so when you think of continuous improvement, you think of software and continuous improvement, but continuous improvement also impacts identity, doesn't it?
Oh, for sure. There's this concept of identity hygiene that's being talked about today. It's an appreciation that this sprawl issue is very pervasive, again, for the federal government as well as commercial organizations. And the way you deal with that issue of hygiene is you go through these steps of cleaning up your environment or the sprawl issues that you're going through. You'll hear the term identity security posture management is sort of the methodology around that. And it often is sort of described in phases where you've got to understand where your data silos exist, what are your human and your non-human accounts that sort of make up your environment, understanding where you've got risks and how those are configured or managed. For a lot of organizations, they'll have these non-human identities, and there's really no logical owner in the organization because these things were created at some point when some system was installed, and they automate a very important business practice, but that organization or the team that put that in place has since moved on. And they fall outside of your typical sort of access review processes that would otherwise ensure that all these systems are entitled in the right way, that you're ensuring that what they can do is what they need to do. And it becomes a very difficult process of sort of managing these things as organizations mature.
Boy, back in the 90s, you'd walk into a law firm and they'd have a couple servers down the hall. It's pretty easy to manage that. Now you're in a situation, you have layers upon layers of federated systems connecting with unfederated, and then shadow IT popping in, and it's really hard to get a handle on all this. And so where does Radiant Logic fit and understand how to manage this for the federal government?
So we are an identity security company, and we help organizations deal with this very pervasive problem of identity sprawl and all the underlying costs and risks that come from that poor identity hygiene. But we take a very data-centric view to that. And we look at this concept of identity security posture management from really three lenses. One, firstly, is understanding and discovering, sort of accounting for all the different places where you've got identity data existing in these siloed systems. And we highlighted many of them already. So these are directories, multiple active directories, HR systems. You may even have identity information related to your employees in their training. So if you have to be certified on a particular system before you can use it, that makes up sort of your profile. And that lives in a training system. So you can sort of appreciate as you're thinking about how I describe the global profile for a human worker, it exists in a lot of different places. So we help unify that into one single trusted source of truth. And then we run a set of data science techniques to help organizations understand where they may have misconfigurations in some of those accounts. And a misconfiguration could be like, I've got an account that's over entitled. Perhaps you've been with the organization for a very long time. You've moved around. You've got a lot of capabilities and systems that you've had since you joined the organization. But in your current job, you really don't need those anymore. We call that an over-entitled account. That creates risk because if you think about the threat today, that's exactly what the threat actors are trying to find is a over-configured or under-managed account that they can compromise. So we have organizations clean that up through a set of analytics techniques, and then we have a real-time monitoring capability to ensure that nothing's changed, or more importantly, no new data has been introduced into the environment.
John, I had some out-of-town guests, and I went downtown, and we saw this and saw that, and there sure were pillars everywhere. I'm thinking about, the federal government, and they have pillars everywhere too. And usually the first pillar is identity. There's a 4 pillars of zero trust, a 7 pillars of zero trust. It always starts with identity. So tell us about the CISA Zero Trust Maturity Model and the role of identity. The first pillar.
And you highlighted it. So the CISA Zero Trust Maturity Model describes pillars of implementation. There's identity, there's devices, networks, and then stages of maturity in each of those. It's important and interesting that identity is the very first pillar, as you highlight, because really without that in place, you really can't enact any of the other aspects of zero trust. And at a super high level, what zero trust is trying to do is sort of appreciate that we don't have this guarded community that we used to have in the past with a network perimeter. That's all changed with single sign-on, sort of remote work, really a dynamic environment. In the federal space, a lot of times this could be, coalitions of multiple defense organizations working together. It could be a NATO exercise. You have a lot of sharing you want to do. And so you have to connect systems with what are considered friendly organizations, but you want to ensure that, no one else has sort of been introduced in that organization unknowingly. So the zero trust principle is that we assume every attempt to use a resource is untrusted. We're going to verify it every time. We're going to introduce these concepts of least privilege You can only do something when you need to do it, sort of this just-in-time model. So identity becomes super foundational to that. Every system that, if you think about, that's making a decision around authentication, are you who you say you are, or authorization, can you do what you're trying to do, needs some aspect of an identity profile to make that decision point. So identity and really the underlying data of identity becomes very critical for the processing of all these systems.
So this is kind of fascinating. I went to your website and I stumbled on a phrase, hygiene remediation workflows. And I've spent years in rooms with software developers and whiteboards and this workflow and that workflow and lines and circles but I never think of workflow when it comes to identity. So is a workflow involved in this then?
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's several workflows I think that play in the identity process, but specific to this concept of hygiene, uh, and I find this a very interesting term, but it's very appropriate because so we use this tagline of get clean and stay clean, and the idea is that your organization is complex. You've got some misconfigurations that exist in there. We describe those as blind spots. It's literally silos of data or a system or an account that lives in your organization, but you're not really able to see it very well because of the complexity. And that blind spot creates a risk and a vulnerability. So a workflow around hygiene remediation is the cleaning process of that. That's not only finding that account, but analyzing it for over entitlements, making sure it has owners, making sure that, like a great example, you may have groups that are defined in your organization that have a bunch of people in there. And the idea of this group is that everyone in this group should be able to do the same things because they work in the same department. But in reality, everyone's got a sort of and but. So it's like, yeah, John has a set of entitlements, but he also needs access to this other thing because he's on a special project. So these groups sort of often become a bit unwieldy and often they don't have owners. Those are great examples of identity systems that could create these over entitlements and definitely things that you want to focus on. These remediation workflows are really trying to identify that.
When we did a show prep interview, I said, well, do you compete with companies like Okta and Ping? And you said, oh, no, we work with them. And so I'm trying to classify you where you fit in the whole hierarchy here. So what you are really at the level of just trying to get clean data for identity. And you can work with Okta and Ping to achieve that, don't you?
100%. So we play this somewhat unique role in the identity market of a unified single source of truth. We are a data layer for most large architectures. This mirrors the reference architecture that was published by NIST's Zero Trust working group that came out of their National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. And it has exactly all the aspects of identity, so access management, privilege access, identity governance, and as a shared but centralized source of identity data that is used for all of those systems that are making decisions. And if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense because you've got all this investment we've done in cybersecurity or identity with tools like Okta and Ping, your endpoint systems like CrowdStrike. And they're all making it a decision around either validating that you are the person you attest to be, or that the resource you're trying to use, an application or some data, that you should have access to that. And what they're evaluating is some policy that has a set of data elements. So the data is really the thing that's enabling that decision to be made. And therefore, you do want that to be as trusted as you can. We play that role.
I like the word trust. If you tell me you are going to be the single source of truth, I'm going to want to know how and how you assure and make sure that's going to be safe. So imagine part of your whole idea is to have this data secure so it can't be corrupted.
Exactly. And every organization will model how their data is developed and brought together. That's part of the aspects of what we call data staging and correlation. And really one of the reasons that we exist in the market and definitely for the federal space is that a lot of the identity systems that are in the market today that organizations use for things like single sign-on or provisioning of accounts and deprovisioning of accounts, they're built to do their authentication or authorization processes. And they're assuming that the data that they're going to use is relatively in one place. You don't often find these systems having very deep ability to do complex data correlation or synchronization of, between systems. So we allow organizations to do that piece and then model how that data is shared. And then to your question about how you just secure that data, you may decide that aspects of your data is only available to certain systems. You may restrict other aspects to just systems that are in like your coalition partners. And the ability to model that data becomes very important because the fact that it's so complex and lives across your environment in so many places.
And that's why. I mean, yeah, we're going to trust you, but you got to show me why we should trust you. And obviously, Radiant Logic has done it because it's so popular.
I think we've got a long history in the federal space. The federal government is, for better or worse, example of a large, complex organization that's grown through, at the time, what was considered innovations. I've got a commercial customer that I work with for a home improvement chain, and the chief architect for identity there has this really great phrase that she says is that today's innovation is tomorrow's legacy. And I think it's really telling because we make these decisions at moments in time around what we think is a game-changing technology or innovation, and over time that gets changed as something else innovates on top of that. But we never sort of get fully sort of off of those decisions of the past. And to a large degree, the federal government is the example of one of the largest and oldest organizations, if you were to think about it as a commercial company. And because of that, they deal with a lot of complexity problems.
So we talked about data staging and orchestration, all kinds of new words here. Let's talk about the hybrid environment that most agencies face themselves in. So I assume that you integrate completely with the hybrid environment based on what an enterprise architect would design. Is that right?
Yes. And in fact, hybrid environments are not only necessary for a lot of the innovations we talked about, the move to cloud, the fact that you still have these systems of record that are running in some on-premise location. If you're in a defense department type of deployment, you actually may want it that way. You've got onboard systems for your naval vessels. If you're in like a maneuver unit, you want the ability to interact with your systems where you are. So hybrid environments are not a legacy thing as much as an operational necessity, but it contributes to the complexity problem. And so you think about systems that are what's called self-managed, or just sort of doing those locally. You've got these cloud-based assets. Perhaps sometimes you're connected to them, maybe sometimes you're not. So you have this sort of synchronization need. And we help organizations sort of solve the data side of that problem. Hybrid's an interesting, perspective because while it has allowed for a great deal of automation and scale with things like, cloud at scale and all the compute capabilities that it brings, it's also created a larger degree of this concept of sprawl, because if you think about all the accounts that I might set up in these hybrid environments to automate things, what we have seen is a really large growth in this concept of non-human identities. And the term you will often hear is like a system or a service account. And you can think about this as some automated thing that happens periodically. And that might be a system that scans data, even runs payroll, some of these automated processes that we do. And it has to pull data from other systems. And to do that, it needs an identity to conduct that exchange. And these are what these system or service account identities have become. And they've grown so much, definitely with this hybrid environment explosion, that it's become a big risk area for a lot of organizations, and absolutely in the federal space. The teams that put these in maybe aren't there anymore. They might have been, created at the installation of a particular application that created them behind the scenes. And so because they don't have logical owners, they often fall outside of the typical access review processes. And the hybrid cloud, although it's opening lots of capabilities, it is to a large degree magnifying this particular problem.
So people are listening to this podcast, they're walking their dog or at the gym or something. They may want to learn more information about Radiant Logic. Is there a white paper you want to direct them to, or something of value for our listeners?
I'd love to give you a link, John, for your podcast site. We've got a great description about our role with real-time identity observability. Sort of talks this identity, security, posture management, hygiene process, and how we do that in real time. I'd encourage readers to take a look at that.
Observe it. Great. What I'll do is you go to federaltechpodcast.com and then look up Radiant Logic, and I'll put that link in the show notes, and you can go right to it and download it. Great. Well, thank you very much.
John, I really appreciate the time.
Yeah, you have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, John Pritchard, CEO of Radiant Logic.